At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire, and then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth, and what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and Bob's Cratchit elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as a golden goblet would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire splurted and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears." "God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreadful the might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with the interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney's corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, if he had better do it, and decease the sulphur population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and he was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant forbearer that wicked can't, until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is, you will decide what men shall live and what man shall die. It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than billions like this poor little man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Miss Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake the day," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I'll have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the orange of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 minutes merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, a full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously with the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie a bed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you would have been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family, they were not well dressed, their shoes were far from being waterproof, their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy and grateful, pleased one another, and counted with the time, and when they faded and looked happier, yet in the bright sprinkling of the Spirit's torch, at parting, Scrooge had his eyes upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily. As Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlours, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showered preparations of a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains readily to be drawn shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tipped lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where woo upon the single man who was near them enter. Artful witches, well they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company, and piling it up its fires half chimney high, blessing on it. How the ghost excluded, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm of flotation on outpouring with generous hands, and its bright unharnessed mirth, and everything within its reach. The very amplifier who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed, though little keened the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word, a warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held its prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Drowned in the west, the settling sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation of an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower and lower, yet was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. What place is this? asked Scrooge. A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth, returned the Spirit. But they know me, see? A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it, passing through the wall of mud and stone. They found cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire, an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gravely in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that slender rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing to them a Christmas song. It has been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely, as they raised their voices, as the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so sure as they stopped his vigour and sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not a sea to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw at last the last of the land, a frightful rage of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thunder of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, fiercely tried to undermine the earth, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks some leagues or so from shore, on which the water chafed and dashed the wild year through. There stood a solitary lighthouse. A great heap of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might surprise as the seaweed of the water rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men who watched the light had made a fire that, through the loophole in the thick stone wall, shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat. They wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder, to which his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figure heard an old ship might be struck up by sturdy song, that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, he told Scrooge, from any shore they lightened on a ship. They stood beside the hellman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, and the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, walking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day that on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking that a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abysses, whose depths were secret, as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize as it was his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at him, same nephew, with approving affability. Ha ha, laughed Scrooge. A nephew, ha ha ha. If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. While Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and the assembly friends, being not a bit behind, roared out lustuously, ha 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 ha. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indulgently. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with dimple, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one, another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head, although she was what you would call provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a commercial old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha, 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 he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sister and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffered by his ill whims? Himself always? Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just dinner and with dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire and lamplight. Well, I am very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eyes upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretch outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereas Scrooge's niece, sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the rose, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge, niece clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revealed in another laugh, as it was impossible to keep the infection off. Through the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar. His example was anatomically followed. I was going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us is not making merry with us is, I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions that he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerks filthy £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring of what they laughed at him, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. They were sung at glee or catch, I assure you, especially Toppler, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a merry nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, while it had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of the Christmas past, when the strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness for life of his own happiness with his own hands without resorting to the sexton spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when it is mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was first a game, a blind man's buff, of course there was, and I no more believe Toppler was readily blind than I believed he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that was done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that they, the Christmas present, knew it, and way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker on an outrage in the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, trembling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there he went. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as one of them did on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, and instantly have slided off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her sickening rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress and further assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and certain chain about her neck, was most monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it when another blind man, being in the office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the games of how and when and where, she was very great, and to the secrets of joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow. Though there were sharp girls too, as Toppler could have told you, there might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, and his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with a guess of quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, but the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eyes, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in the head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in the mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this the spirit could not be done. Here's a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest might find out what, but he only answering to their questions, yes or no, the case. The brisk fire of questioning came when he was exposed, elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather than disagreeable animal, a savage animal. An animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show off, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagance, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was inexpressibly tickled, and that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. What is it? Cried Fred. It's your Uncle Scrooge. Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal settlement, through some objected that the reply to "it is a bear" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as the answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He had given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hands in the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge—" "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he have it, nevertheless, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge have imperceptibly become so grey and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an unaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath, and the last words spoken by his nephew and he and the spirit were again upon the travels. Much they saw, far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and there were patience, and in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich, and in atmosphere, hospital and jail, and misery everywhere, refuge where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessings and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts on this, because the Christmas holiday appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party. When he looked at the spirit as they stood together in an open space, he noticed that its hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the folding of its robes it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They kneeled down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, merged, ragged, scrawled, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and torched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat and wrathed, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No chance, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries a wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could not say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorant, this girl is want. Beware of both, and all of their degree. But most of all beware this boy, for on brow I see that written is torch is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye, admit it for you factious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are these no prisons? Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about for the ghost and saw it not. The end.